Hello Vue Nation, and welcome to my talk. I will talk about composing Vue.js Forms with vee-validate. First, a little bit about me. I am Abdelrahman Awad, Senior Frontend Engineer at Octopods. I created and maintain vee-validate for Vue.js since 2016. I write about Vue.js, JavaScript, TypeScript at my blog, logarithm.com. So, let's talk about composing logic with components first before we dive into the composition API itself. I will quickly showcase like 3 problems that pop up often in the issues reported in the vee-validate repository. And these issues really illustrate the common pinpoints of dealing with composition using higher order components. So in this example right here, we have the form component, which is a vee-validate component, version 4. That's a higher order component that allows you to grab the errors, for example, and handle submit to perform submissions. Right here, we are not doing anything special, and it works out because it's fairly simple. But once we try to complicate stuff a little bit, for example, we want to have a model component containing that form, and we want to close the model once the form succeeds in the submission. So this is fairly a finicky situation, but it is very common. And I have 2 buttons, each using a different method to do that. The first one is using the validate method, and it's really complicated, and it does a lot of things right here in the template, which makes it really ugly. So if you really got surprised by that, yeah, that's not a good thing to have in your template. Same thing for the button down there, but here's the thing, only one of them does it correctly, and it's actually the first one. So the second one doesn't work because handle submit, while it takes a success handler, you cannot compose something into that success handler yourself. So the onSubmit function that you created needs to close the model itself. Otherwise, it wouldn't work. So you can't compose it in that way. And the first one does it because it's just calling what you would do inside the success handler if you have access to everything there. So, and since you don't, because handle submit only lives in the scooped slot, you don't have access to it, and you can't really do that. Another issue is callbacks. So let's say you want to reset the form when the model closes. If we stuck with the initial implementation, the previous slide, so the model component is the parent of the form component, it wouldn't work because then the model doesn't have access to the reset form function, which is available inside the scooped slot of its child. And this is where it begins to be really complicated, and you need to start thinking about the order of your compositions. So with higher order components, the direction or the order of your composition matters, and you can't really layer them randomly and expect the same result. You will always have it's not a reversible operation. You can't just flip 2 components together, expect them to behave the same. Of course, some components may work like that, but in this case, it doesn't. So you have to make the form component the parent of the model. And this messes up with your mental thinking of the HTML markup already, because, well, I want the form inside the model, not the other way around. But you can change that the form component can be a renderless component, and it will work that way. So it won't render anything, and you will place the form manually inside that model. And yeah, this is complicated. And if you didn't understand anything I just said, this is because it's really bad. So this is one of the downsides of dealing with the composition using higher order components. Another thing is state, having access to state. So right here, I'm trying to create a computed property called hasErrors that needs access to the errors object, but that's only available inside the scooped slot of the form component, which is problematic because you can't really access it in your script, and this pretty much blocks you from doing it. So I don't need to sing the praises of the composition API because I think you have already seen a lot of talks over the past 2 years, I think, that covers why the composition API is better at these things. But I'm just giving you a better understanding over it's these common issues that people keep running into. This is why we'll talk about the composition API in this. I already talked about the components API, gave a lot of examples of them over the past talks over the last year, but in this talk I will focus mainly on the composition API and what it can do for you. So let's quickly recap what the validation composition API in vee-validate is. So all vee-validate components have composition variants of them. So if you have used the field component or the form component, you can have access to their variants, which is useField, useForm. There is also field array, and you have useField array and others. So you can think of both flavors, both the components API and the composition API, as outlets to the same API. And actually, the components internally are implemented using the composition function of them. So field component is actually a generic component that's built using useField. Same thing for the form component. It is built internally using useForm. So they are just one possibility, one generic possibility that has multiple uses that you can use in your application. And it fits most cases, but sometimes it doesn't. And this is where you should use the composition API. And because they are built, the components are built using the composition API, you can mix between them. You can use the form component for your custom inputs that are created with useField, or the other way around. You can use your fields inside of your custom form components. So it works both ways. So quickly, let's show you what each function contains. So in useField, we are creating right here, a field with a validator function. And you have multiple ways to do validation, by the way. You can use yup to perform validation. You can use the old Laravel way to do it, or you can use plain JavaScript functions. And right here, we are accessing a bunch of stuff from the useField function. The most common is value, error message, and the meta object. These are the states. There are a bunch of other methods available for you. So check the API in the documentation if you really want to know more about what it offers. For the form, you can use useForm. Again, these are the most common things that people use in that API, which is reset form, validate, handle submit, errors, and the submitting. So yeah, it gives you access to a bunch of cool stuff. And how it works really is when you call useField, vee-validate creates a field in that component's context. So that component that called useField can be treated as a field. Same thing for forms. The component that called useForm can be treated as a vee-validate form. And this will come in handy in the next example. So in this example right here, you have, we are not using any kind of UI, which is weird, but you can do that. You can use vee-validate as a kind of imperative validation library without having a template whatsoever. And while it's not built for that, it's pretty much still possible. Right here, we have a simple form with an email and password. We're using schema validation to perform the validation for both fields. And yeah, this is basically it. This is how a basic form will look like with a composition API without any kind of UI bindings. Now, let's talk about something really useful. And this is what I think, what I believe the composition API vee-validate is built for. This is what I had, what the vision I had for it. So you use it to create your custom UI components. So in this example, we are creating a custom input component, a text input component that uses useField to basically register this component as a field for any kind of vee-validate form out there or that uses it. And this immediately allows you to access error messages. So you get validation, you get the value model created for you, you get a bunch of cool stuff. And what this really does for you is right here, we can finally replace the 3-liners we had for each field with just 1-liner because we have packed all that functionality into a single component. And this is what makes forms really easy and to maintain and easier to understand. So historically, vee-validate has always been a template-based library when it comes to validation, but right now it's something more. It allows you to build your own style of template-based validation, or you can still go back to being imperative style and doing everything in the script. It's entirely up to you. So the line has blurred between the two styles, and one really enables the other in some way. And same way you can build a custom form component. Right here we are using useForm to create a component, and we are using the handle submit function that allows you to create a submission handler that you can bind to whatever kind of events you really want. So right here we are binding it to the click button for the event. And notice we are using the custom component we just created, and we are also using the vee-validate field component. So again, you can mix and match between them depending on what you really need. And if it works for you, then fine. Both are created using the same API after all. One more thing. So in the beginning, I showed you a bunch of issues that usually pop up with the higher order components. In composition at least, and this is how you would solve them using the composition API. So right here, we are controlling the model visibility is open, and we are just setting it to false in our own submission handler. So we can do that directly because we have access to it. And for the computed has errors property, we have access to the errors. So you can simply check if there are any keys inside the errors object. One last thing is, since the reset form is part of the useForm API, we can make it available to the entire component by returning it in the setup function, or I'm here using the single file component setup syntax. So it makes it automatically available because I'm already using it in the template. And this makes it really easy to compose whatever kind of custom logic you have into your own components and multiple behaviors on top of each other. So I think this is really nice way to use the composition API, and it's really straightforward. Right now, I'll show you a quick succession of examples that illustrate the power and flexibility of the composition API with vee-validate. So first, we have something called the eager validation. So eager validation is a behavior where your validation trigger changes depending on the validity of the field. So what we want to have right now is, sometimes you don't want the field to validate on each keystroke, but instead you want it to be lazy. So it validates whenever the user leaves the input. So on change or on blur. However, sometimes you also want it to be aggressive. So when the field is already invalid, you want it to be eager for success. And you really want to have the two at the same time. This is why it's called eager validation. So you can simply do that using like an object right here that binds the handle change function with a helper function that UseField offers, that allows you to automatically handle native HTML or custom components events. So throw it on an event and to automatically do whatever is necessary to sync the value and figure out if any state should be updated. So here we are binding it directly to the blur and change because it's always going to validate on blur and change. But handle change, you can tell it not to perform any kind of validation if you send it false as a second argument. So this is the should validate argument. And this argument, we can really make it so that you can validate only when the error message is available. So when there is an error message, you perform validation. Otherwise, you don't, and this gives you exactly the behavior that you are looking for. So it's not very aggressive, and it's not slow either. So it is eager for success, which really gives a nice experience. Of course, you can build your own triggers and whatever trigger logic you really want to. The next example we have is we have this basic form that we want to enhance the UX aspect of it. So what I want to have here is a form that automatically detects whenever an invalid submission has been made and scrolls the user to the field that failed and focuses it for them. So this really makes for a nice experience, especially if you are dealing with a really long form where the user can't see some of the inputs. So some inputs may be outside the viewport, and you want them to see it so they can be able to correct it. Otherwise, they would be confused. Like they will be clicking the submit button and it's not submitting, and they have no idea why. Well, now you can tell them in a much better way. So the handle submit function in use form can accept a second argument. So the first argument is the success handler, and you can have a fail handler or invalid submission handler. And this only executes when the user tries to submit the form. It doesn't execute any other way. So when the user submits the form and if it turns out invalid, this will be executed and will give you the behavior that you need. And what's really cool about this is I can use this form component everywhere in your app and it will do the same thing. So you have successfully composed the this UX behavior into this form that you can use anywhere. And this is what I think the composition API is really good at. Another complicated example right here is custom checkboxes. So checkboxes are simply deceptive kind of components to build, because checkboxes really work in two different modes, so to speak. So the first mode is single mode. So you have a single checkbox. It can be either true or false, or some value and false, or some value or undefined. So it toggles between two values mostly. But when it's a part of a group, so you have multiple checkboxes bound to the same model, then it will append each checkbox's value to the array. So if the checkbox is ticked, its value will be inside that array. Otherwise, it won't. So in a way, it's a multi-select component. So this is why some libraries, UI libraries, use a checkbox group component that traps these checkboxes, so they can be able to do that kind of logic and be able to determine whether it's single or not. Now, if you are not aware of that, this can make building this component really hard and pretty much confusing, but vee-validate makes it really easy for you. For example, right here, vee-validate, when you tell it that the field you are building right here is a checkbox, it automatically changes certain behaviors about that. For example, you have the handle change and you have the checked property. You can use the checked property to pretty much assign that checked property on your inputs, or right here, I'm not even using an input. You can do something else entirely, like displaying the checked value and some other emoji. And handle change will automatically understand what kind of mode it should operate on. For example, when the user clicks on that field, it will do one of two things. So right here, we have the two examples or the two modes the checkbox will behave in. So this is just the component that I showed you. And the first one, there is only a single checkbox that's called single. And vee-validate will understand that. Yeah, this field doesn't have any kind of siblings. And I will operate this field in a single checkbox mode. So when it's checked, its value will be alone. Otherwise, its value will be either undefined or false, depending on what you set it. The other checkboxes have the same name. So vee-validate will, hey, I already have this field named multiple, and you register two more. So they are a group, and I will treat them as such. And when you submit the form, vee-validate will give you these kind of values. It will give you the single field value if it's checked, and it will give you the multiple in array for the checked ones. So it looks like this. Another example is field arrays. Field array or array fields are fields that the user can add a bunch of them. For example, a bunch of emails, a bunch of URLs, and this is really kind of common use case with forms, and managing them was kind of a little bit complicated because you always had to figure out a unique identifier for your elements, so you couldn't have really an array of primitives like this one. But vee-validate steps in right here with a composition API. Also, there is a variant for it, for the components API, to help you do that in a really nice way. Right here, you can create a form, give it an initial value. So right here, we are starting off with a single link and the initial value, and we are calling UseField array that gives us a really nice API. It includes the fields array, which is an array of objects wrapping your values. So you don't have to wrap them yourself to create these identifiers. And these wrapping objects automatically have an assigned key to them, so you can use it in your iteration. And this is really nice because it is always unique. It's always assigned to that entry in particular, and you don't have to worry about it again, as long, of course, as you manipulate it using the other functions. So right here, we can push or remove an item, but you can do a lot more. You can swap, insert, replace, and many others. So check the API out in the documentation to figure out what's possible there. Thank you, and I will be answering all your questions in the QA session shortly. Thank you.